what was important was not for me to spin the situation. It was to connect with people on a human level, right? And help them feel like they've got some control, some power, some influence over a situation that felt totally out of control for them. So he was a great coach. There's this human behavior called reciprocity that gets triggered. People want to help people who really want to change, and they can sniff out a fake real quick. Right? But when somebody wants to know and wants to change, we are wired to be willing to help.
Welcome to Encouraging Leaders, a podcast that exists to remind CEOs and senior leaders that you do not have to lead alone. I'm Mark D. Braun, and today we're joined by a special friend and leader, Jon Spiesman. Jon is the CEO and founder of 1% Better Leader. He spent nearly 22 years growing his leadership chops with Monsanto in the ag space at all different levels. He happens to be a chemical engineer, which is my background as well, which is just fun to geek out about. And he's an avid sportsman, outdoors. He loves downhill sports like heli-skiing and mountain biking. Jon, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, when's the last time you were outside, first of all, just doing an outside sport?
Yesterday.
Not surprising at all. Yeah. I love whenever I call you and you're like, out in the back, in the mountains of Utah, enjoying the beauty. I'm excited about having this conversation. I'm going to start the same way I've started with every one of the podcasts. I just asked you a question because it was one of the things that really changed for me in leadership is if you go back through your leadership journey, when did you realize that you didn't have to lead alone?
Yeah, I think the have to part it didn't come to me immediately. I think for me, it felt more like I realized I can't lead alone. And the first time I think that happened for me was I was a site manager at a plant in Wyoming. And when I arrived there, the plant had some significant issues with the state Department of Environmental Quality. They had an issue with an air permit that they'd been working on for a number of years that hadn't been resolved. And essentially, we were on a clock. Basically, we had to solve the problem by a certain date or the plant was going to get shut down. They were going to revoke our permit. And it was difficult to step in, into leadership in that situation. Because there were technical issues, right? There were technical issues, legal issues, things that I had to navigate that were technical in nature. But the bigger challenge was the people side, right? So I had a group of people that, were human beings, right? There were human beings that many of them had worked at this site for 30 years. It was all they knew. And what they knew was under threat, direct threat.
Yeah.
And that really hit me. It hit me on multiple levels, right? It hit me in the sense of, oh my gosh, how difficult would that be, right? These are men with families. This is everything for them. They don't know what they would do, right, if this site went down. So it kind of hit me on an emotional level, and I didn't really know how to respond. Like I was pretty young, like I was kind of immature, in a way, and I kind of really felt out of my element and over my head a little bit, and so I realized I couldn't do it on my own. So I had this great guy, the kind of superintendent of the plant, that he was a bit of a father figure for me, and I started sharing with him some of the challenge. I don't know how to deal with some of the emotion I'm getting from these guys, and I know you're in this same situation. You're close to retirement, so you're probably not, feeling quite at risk, but I don't know how to deal with these guys. And he helped me. He helped me, understand that what was important was not for me to spin the situation. It was to connect with people on a human level, right? And just, and help them feel like they've got some control, some power,
Yeah.
some influence over a situation that felt totally out of control for them. So he was a great coach. Right? He was maybe one of
Yeah.
my first leadership coaches, if you will. I had many, many over the years, but that's the first one that really jumps out to me where I really truly felt like not that I couldn't lead alone, that I fundamentally just had run out of my own power, right? And I was
Yeah.
like, I was in a spot where I didn't know what to do.
Yeah. I love that. You recognized you needed help and then you found it. I think about this person was he on your team or was he above your level? Like, what was his role relative to you? Did you report to him or did he,
He
how was
reported
he?
to me. He
He reported to
reported
you.
to
So
me. Yeah.
he just happened to be older and you recognized
Yeah.
something about him. What did you see in him that allowed you to be open about not knowing what to do?
He was an approachable guy. He was just kind of a human guy that was he did a lot of things really well, but he also like had learned a lot of rough lessons through life.
Yeah.
His name was Ron, and early on in life, he kind of came up rough. He kind of came up like he thought he was going to be a professional boxer. That didn't work out. He just he had a lot of ups and downs in his life that he was pretty open about, and he had a code. He had a set of principles that made him. He had a clear kind of magnetic attraction. His guys had a magnetic attraction toward him, a deep
Yeah.
respect.
Yeah.
Which made me curious. Like it was like, this is somebody I can learn from.
Yeah, and you also mentioned, I love that. So he had deep values. What I also heard in the first share was just that he didn't have risk, like he didn't feel at risk himself. Like he was able to be fully present for you for whatever reason. It happened to be maybe because of age or experience or not being as threatened by the loss of job. But that availability, you sensed it or you described it when you're reflecting back.
Yeah, and I was wrong. I was wrong about that. I'll be clear about that. Like he definitely felt at risk.
Yeah.
He definitely was experiencing all the same things. He was not without fear.
Yeah.
It's just that he was able to transcend fear. He was able to say, I can still be here for this person, even though I also still feel the same challenge.
Yeah. Well, it's such a cool story. It allows me to think about times, you were vulnerable to share, you were willing to share that you needed help and you were finding people around that could do it and you tested him and he was able to speak back into a young leader. It's such a cool story. I mean, if you fast forward through that, that was the time when you needed a coach. If you think about when did you shift into thinking about leadership as being available for others in that coaching role? When did that start to enter your mind and you start to play a role that was actually playing that role for others?
Yeah, yeah. It was actually my very next role where I moved into a completely different environment and where I really didn't know anything about the process of what was being done at this plant. It was a very complex chemical plant. There were lots of new challenges, new things that I had to consider. And the guy who hired me put me intentionally with I was again over this guy that was further on in his career, and he was a very solid operator. Like he knew a lot about the operation and knew a lot about. And turns out he knew a lot about leadership. But the guy I was working for knew that I needed a solid lieutenant to be able to get my footing. And so I went into this job, and kind of predictably, first thing I did was kind of throw myself into learning and getting, trying to become a little bit, bridge the knowledge gap and become a little bit closer to expert, even though that is a fallacy. But this guy his name was Bruce. also, I think filled a similar role in the sense of like, I could see that he had something around leadership that I could learn from.
Mm-hmm.
And what that was also that kind of first step, I guess, into more of an example that was a servant leader, of somebody who really saw his role as lifting people up, and his role as finding the talents of other people and helping them to explore those things. And again, he just had an interesting style, a way to go about it. And I started to really see, I think during that time, different dimensions of leadership, and how as a leader, it's not about, hierarchy, or it's not about telling people what to do, that the role really is much more about helping people to explore and find their potential.
Yeah.
So I think it was kind of that next role would be one of the times that I really observed that.
Well, it's interesting. So the first role that you described, you're becoming coachable. You're learning how to receive feedback and input from others, and it happened to be somebody on your team. And the second role, you're actually learning that idea, the power of being coach-like in your leadership, being using coaching or developing others as the primary aim of it. And servant leadership is one way to describe that. It's a great story. Then, so you keep on going, and you're building that coaching into your leadership, and you're helping to guide and to develop. What have you found? Any one of the keys for you as you're doing that role, because you do have leadership responsibility, you've got performance metrics that you have to deliver, and you're trying to bring the best out of others. What are some of the keys for you in doing that well as a leader?
Oh boy, I mean, I described a couple of early experiences where I was learning, but I think for that one, I really need to go back to a foundation that I had around leadership that kind of created some of my values for leadership, and that was when I was a kid. I was probably 12 years old. My dad was a railroader, and he worked for a nationwide railroad called the Milwaukee Road back then. And this was back in the 80s, during some economic turmoil. That nationwide railroad folded, and overnight he was out of work. And that's a formative experience in itself, right? Seeing your father, struggle with that, and
Yeah.
the economic insecurity, and the way it affected both he and my mom, and the family discussions around that. But then the next thing that happened was what really formed some of my early values around leadership. The local lumber companies really needed a way to get their product to market. And so they were like, well, we can either pay for trucking, which we were pretty remote, so trucking costs a lot, or we can figure out a way to get this railroad up and running. And so they created another company to buy the section of railroad and create a short line railroad. And in that process, they were like, well, we need to if we're going to have a railroad, we got to have people to work at the railroad. And so this new leadership proceeded to try to figure out how to get people back. And this whole process of the communication that they were doing with the old employees was very non-transparent. It was very unclear what was happening. It was unclear who was in charge. It was unclear whose interests, what their interests were. And then at some point, they really started some really, I'd say, it felt unethical behavior toward those employees. They started leveraging them. They started saying, well, I think being a little bit untruthful, or not telling, the whole story, and basically coming back to them at some point and saying, well, you got to take a giant pay cut to come back and work here, because, that's just the way it's going to be. And really left people with no choice. And I saw the human effect of that on my dad. I saw the frustration that he had. It was kind of dehumanizing. He wasn't involved. Nobody was nobody was being negotiated with. It was all power, right? It was all kind of power, not transparent, and my dad felt very disrespected. I remember this very well when he retired, I think 21, 22 years later. And he said, well, I almost got back to the same amount per hour when I retired as I was making before the railroad folded 21, 22 years ago. So he carried that resentment around with him toward that company and those leaders, right, for his whole life. And,
Wow.
For me as a kid, I just remember the part about the effect that it had on my dad, the emotions that it brought up for him, and the determination that created in me to not ever be that kind of leader. Right? I didn't really know what leadership meant, but I knew that treating people like that was not the way to get the best out of anybody. What it did is create dependency, resentment. It created all these negative dynamics that just aren't healthy, right? So I think when you talk about leadership and leadership development, that's a backdrop that I think I was lucky enough to have, and that's why, for instance, the first two stories I told you, I'm getting stuff from people who worked for me. Like it created an openness for me, that value of respect, of treating people like they know something, treating people like an adult, treating people like they're valuable and that they have something to offer, was a huge part of leadership for me, all the way through. And so that helped me to be in a position to absorb lessons from other people along the way. So that was a very long answer to your question.
No, it's
I don't know if I
so
came around.
good. I think about the value that you learn, respect for people, and you actually learned it from leaders that were doing the opposite. I'm reminded, my dad shared, I had really good leaders early on, and then I got into leaders that weren't acting the same as those leaders. And I was telling him about these bad leaders. And he said, Mark, you can learn from any leader. You can either learn what to do or what not to do.
Yep.
And so you learned what not to do. And, that learning mind, being able to just keep on learning and growing, whether it's be for good examples or for bad. I love that. And then you were able to carry that forward. It allowed for coachability and learning and respect, because you respected the people that you had the privilege to lead. You were able to open up, and they felt that respect, and they were able to share back, and you were able to learn from them. It just feels like a phenomenal. I love that story.
Well, and I think the connection to coaching that you asked about, I think was, number one is that foundation of respect. And that's why I went back to that, right? Is that I think it's very difficult to lead people in a coaching way if you don't fundamentally have respect for them as a human being and as an employee, as somebody who has something to offer, something to teach you. The other part of it, and this part I kind of lucked into, the company I worked for moved us around a lot, and there's many pros and cons to that. But one of the things that really helped me to develop a coaching style was the fact that by moving around a lot, I was never an expert in any single thing. So I was often in a learning mode, and I was often leading people and expected to drive results of an organization, the details of which I didn't understand. So that puts you in a position to, number one, be curious. You want to learn as much as you can, to be respectful, because you need respect to be able to get people to open up and to be able to learn and understand what's really going on. And you have to get better and better at asking questions. And asking questions to help connect dots for people. So the thing that I couldn't do is tell somebody running a logistics department how to get the most, the best bid for dollars per mile, right?
You didn't have that functional expertise, right?
I don't have that functional expertise, right?
Right.
But what I could do is number one, provide for them context. I could bring information to them and set context for them so that they understand what's important. What are they being asked to do? So what's clarity look like? And then ask them, how can you contribute? Like, how can you help? Right? Because I don't know. I got, and by doing that, right, I'm actually helping them to see the direction and opt in, right? And come in. And then my role becomes more about what do you need to be successful at that? And how can I, and I get to help them to be successful. And sometimes, my role is to hold them accountable, right? So, well, you said you were going to do this, right? So it's not going very well. What's going on? What are you learning? And what do we need to change?
Yeah. Yeah. So you learned how to ask questions because you didn't actually know the functions that you were leading. And you got that pretty early. You said, what age were you when you did the site manager role? Do you remember?
28.
Yeah, so very early in your leadership journey, you're already out ahead, and you don't have expertise on all the areas that you're leading, and your organization was putting you in places where they knew that, which is an area for you to grow and learn and keep on pushing ahead. And so I love that. We work. Encouraging Leaders works with CEOs and senior executives, and every one of them has people underneath them that have more knowledge than they do about areas.
Yeah.
And so I remember that so vividly, that shift whenever I didn't know more than the people I was leading about the things that they were doing. And it freaked me out. I mean, I was like, oh, what do I do now? And my operating model didn't work. It was like, I remember taking tests and I had to be the smartest guy in the room to get an A.
Right.
And now it was not that kind of a thing. It was different. And so I love that you learned that, and questions were the way through that. Those questions, to be able to know how to ask really good questions to be able to support them, feels like such a great way to do it. If you think about now, you're seeing these people unlock and grow, and you're there guiding, but basically helping support them as they do it. It's been so fun working together for the last 3 years. You happen to have 100% success rate on getting leaders that you're coaching to grow in significant ways. We get to measure that. What do you think how does it feel? Talk to me about how does it feel first to see somebody unlock and start to grow? How does that feel to you?
It's, that's why I got into this work. I mean, for me, it's, it's fulfilling on multiple levels, right? It's often, the interesting thing is that, on the one hand, you could say, gosh, it's so great to be able to help other people to learn and to grow. But the payback I get, part of it is the satisfaction of seeing them do that. But the amazing thing is also what I learned through the process. They think that I'm helping them and that's the transaction, that's what's happening. But they're so many times helping me, right? Because I get to see the breakthrough, what they've had to do in order to change. And it inspires me. I just had a very recent example of this. I worked with this guy named Ed, and Ed was a VP of a division of a company, and this division was really strategic to the company.
Yeah.
They needed it to be successful, but Ed had, he was hired because he knew a lot about this area of the company, and he had a huge drive. Now the problem was that Ed had kind of a win at all costs mentality. He didn't collaborate. He kind of ran over people. He kind of offended people with brutal feedback. And he was struggling. He was struggling to be successful and fit into the company culture. And so Ed came to me. I was asked to coach Ed, and Ed's own feedback was, people don't want to work with me. and something needs to change. And so I started working with Ed, and the amount of courage that Ed exhibited and humility to be open to his coworkers about his situation and his desire, that he wanted to improve things, but he didn't know how, and he needed their help to be able to do it. It would make me emotional sometimes on the calls. Like, I could just see how hard it was for him, and how taxing it was sometimes for him to summon the courage. And I got to encourage him. I got to try to encourage him and breathe courage into him, but I also got courage back. And then I hang up the phone with Ed, and I'm off dealing with some problem that I'm afraid of, that I don't want to do. There's some new thing that I'm afraid of and I might fail. And I'm like, what would Ed do? Like, so like people I don't think understand how much coaches get back from their clients, through that kind of thing of like the mutuality of it, I think is really one of the things that keeps me coming back. Like I'm getting goosebumps talking about it.
Yeah, you got I tingled, and whenever I tingle, it means that I'm like feeling some pretty intense emotions, and it gives me goosebumps to hear about Ed and your relationship being safe enough for him to experiment and courageously try things that are not his natural style, because he wants something that he doesn't have. He wants better relationships at work. He wants more effectiveness. He's got drive, but he needs to adjust his behaviors. And then you're watching that. You're not only getting to experience that, which gives you enormous emotional, it gives you stuff, but you're also then more encouraged to go out and do your own work.
Right.
Yeah, it's so powerful. I'm just thinking about the virtuous cycle of coaching. It's like it gives more than it receives. It's one of the paradoxes of life. It feels like the same thing as the wisdom traditions that say if you give 1, you get 10 back. I mean, that's what I'm reminded of when you say that.
Absolutely.
And I have felt that so many times now, and I can't believe how powerful it is for me. The feeling and the encouragement that I get from witnessing, being close enough to another human being, invited in optionally for them to say yes to coaching, and then to be able to help, just be alongside them, encouraging them alongside it. Thank you for sharing that. I know that the process that you use involves other people. You mentioned it in the work with Ed, and so. Describe why do you involve other people in the coaching? Because a lot of coaches just deal with one-on-one coaching, and they're not involving the other team members. Why do you choose to do that? Why do we choose to do that? What's the benefit there for you?
Yeah, one-on-one coaching works. Like it can absolutely work. But I think involving other people brings some really important benefits, and one of those is the fact that as a coach, I'm not there. I'm not on the field. I'm not in the room. Like I don't really know what's going on. All I have is what the person's telling me. Right. So there's a ground truth element to involving people that are actually on the team. Right. It makes it real. Right. The other thing that involving people on the team does is for the coachee. Right. It does several things. Number one, when they involve people around them, it demonstrates, number one, a huge willingness to change. Right. So if you're going to come out and say, I think I need to get better at this and I need your help, there's this human behavior called reciprocity that gets triggered. People want to help people who really want to change. And they can sniff out a fake real quick, right? But when somebody wants to know and wants to change, we are wired to be willing to help.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, the people who are maybe your fiercest critics are put in a conundrum of, man, this guy pisses me off, but he says he wants to change. Like, so I have to help him, right? So it automatically, you start to get fans. You make fans out of your detractors in a sense. And then the third thing is that they are the ones who can give the very best feedback and suggestions to somebody about what they can do better. So like in the case of Ed, right? He was working on listening with an open mind, right? So making sure people felt like they were listened to. Well, Ed's a poor judge of that, obviously. But who is a good judge? The people who he's supposed to be listening to.
Yeah.
Right. So they can tell him directly that felt like being listened to and that did not. Right.
Right. They can give positive and negative feedback quickly.
Yep. So I just think for working on specific leadership behaviors, there's nothing better than involving other people. And there's many different ways you can do it. One way that I remember stumbling into that worked far beyond anything I expected at the time was, for me, I was leading a large organization, and often I needed to be up on stage in front of people presenting. And one of the things that I was working on particular aspects of this, trying to become a little bit more inspirational to people. And I started using my team as a mirror. And I would say, like, you know what, I'm trying to accomplish this. Can you watch how it goes during the meeting and give me feedback on what worked and didn't work? And two things immediately happened. Number one, and there were two people in particular that loved being on the inside. They loved it. They got so energized every time I would tell them. And if I didn't tell them what I was trying to do ahead of time, they were knocking on my door right before the presentation. Like, what am I doing this? What am I watching for this time?
What am I going to give you feedback on this time?
What am I going to give you feedback on? Like, they dug it. They loved it. And the thing is that I'm on stage. I've got a million things going through my head. I'm trying to do some new things at the same time. What do you think my ability is to read the room and see what's landing with people and what's not? Like, I've got no bandwidth for that.
Right. You're barely making it through the presentation, right?
Yeah. Now I've got 6 people out there looking for that stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I got such great feedback from them about what landed and what didn't land, and stuff I didn't even expect. They'd give me feedback about things I didn't ask for feedback about because they knew I was trying to get better. So it was like such an aha moment for me. Like, whoa, this is way better than I expected. So you don't have to like do it formally, right? You can do it just around an event like that, a meeting, an important meeting, or whatever. It works awesome.
You can naturalize or normalize the process of asking for and receiving feedback so that people knock on your door. Can you imagine that? Knocking on your door saying, hey, I know you want my feedback, so I'm going to give it to you. Tell me what I'm looking for. And that is that's the whole loop that I have seen over and over and over. And if I could give one gift to every leader, that willingness, that desire, that skill of seeking feedback from the people around them, what a gift that is that you've gotten to receive over and over and over and over. And now you get to share with other leaders like Ed and other CEOs and senior leaders. I love that story. Last question, just because I want to wrap up on time. If you were going to go back to your early self, you've got the young Jon's coming out of school, he's getting into leadership, and you could give him any message right now. You could say anything you want him to know, any leadership lesson, anything that you say, hey, listen, this is what you need to know going into this leadership ranks. What would you share with that younger self? There's a lot of young leaders out there that listen to this podcast, so we'd love for you to be able to share what you would want to share with them.
Man, that is a tough one. I think for me, I struggled a lot with understanding that my self-worth was not connected to my achievement. And so I would say, you're worth it the way you are. Now go out and don't be afraid to fail. Take some risks and go for it. Regrets happen because of things you didn't try. I don't yet regret anything I've tried and failed.
Say that again.
I think regret happens only for things that you don't try. I've never regretted something I tried, even when I failed.
I love that. So you would go back and share with your younger self that you're worth it just as exactly as you are. Your results are not tied to your worth. You're worth it. Now go out and try with all your might, because you'll never regret trying and failing, but you will regret not trying at all.
Right.
What a message for the people that are listening today. If you are out there, you're a CEO, senior leader, and you're thinking, how do I get to the next level of leadership? If you'd love to talk to Jon or myself about what coaching looks like, you can find both of us at encouragingleaders.com. Set a 15-minute meeting with us. We'd love to meet you and encourage you in any way in your team. Thank you so much for listening. And Jon, thank you so much for being here, sharing some of your leadership
Thanks,
lessons.
Mark. Really appreciated the time. Thanks for your kind interviewing.